Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we're going to be continuing on making React components, and we have another problem where we have to make a React component, and this time it's going to be a form. So let's take a read of the requirements. We're going to be making a flight booker form, and the user can choose between two flight options, one-way flight and return flight. There's two date input fields, and the return date input is displayed if the return flight option is chosen, hidden otherwise. Form validation, dates are in the past, return date is before departure date, and upon successful submission, we have some kind of a message with the date, and here's an example. And the nice thing about this, once again, is so they tell you to use a date here, and we can actually see what we're building, so I think this is very convenient. So this is what it's supposed to look like. So we have a selector where we have a one-way flight or a return flight. We pick a date. When we pick the date, it can't be before today's date, so right now it's the 9th. So we can't pick or actually I think it right now is the 8th, sorry. Yeah, it's the 8th, so it defaults to the 8th, and you can't pick anything before then, right? And then if we go to the return flight, you can pick anything up to here, but then their return date can't be before the departure date, right? So if we're departing on the 8th, we have to return on the 8th or later. Similarly, if we go to another day, let's say we go to till January 2026, then we can't arrive back before then. It wouldn't make any sense, right? If we depart, then this date has to be after that, and then we're going to click book. So they tell you this little warning, and if we have the right dates, then they tell you you booked the flight, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we're going to be building a form, and there's a couple things that we're going to go over when building a form, and the first being is forms can be controlled or uncontrolled, meaning our inputs in here, we can either save them in the state, or we can just let them be, and then once the user submits the form, we can just take those inputs and use them. And typically you want to use refs for that. I personally like making controlled forms, so we're going to build a controlled form, and I'm going to kind of show you the logic for it. So let's get started. So the first thing we need is we need to actually figure out what we need. So also notice that there are no labels here, right? But we do want to, for accessibility, if you don't have labels, you can make these things called area labels, which they won't have the title, but they'll still have that accessibility. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import useState, and we're going to have a couple other things. And also, if you wanted to make a generic form, like we talked about in the other video, you could have a component that just takes in data, but because we only just have this app, we're not going to do that, so we're just going to make the specific form. But you could do the same thing I did in the other video, where you have a component that takes in data, maybe the type of input into the form, some kind of data, things like that, and maybe some parameters like the min, max, or whatever, and you could make a generic form. But in this case, we'll make the specific thing. So first we're going to import a useState, right, because we're going to make a controlled form. So a controlled form, every single field that gets filled out, we will store it in a state. So we're going to do that. Then the other thing we really need is we need today's date, right? So we need today's date, and the way we could do that is we can just do this. So we can say constant date, and we can make it out here. We're just going to assume that our app, I guess technically if it gets ran today and it keeps going, it's not going to, we're going to make the date outside of the component. So if it gets ran today and then in whatever, an hour, it's the next day, it will have a little error. You could make the date in here if you want to as well, but we're just going to assume our app will get refreshed every time there's a new day. So we're not going to worry about it being correct for every single day if it just runs for hours and hours and hours. It'll be correct for the time that it's running right now. Okay, so we're going to make a new date. And the problem is this is an object, so we still can't access it. So we really need our thing if you look, we need it in this format, year, month, day. And so the way we can do that is there is a toIso string. So if we take a look, and you can just Google a bunch of date commands to how to get today's date. There's a bunch of ways to do it. And essentially, if we actually print this, so console log date now, let's take a look. So here's what it looks like, but we really need this left part. So we're going to split it on the T. So it'll be an array of 2 elements. This will be the first one. This will be the second element. And then we'll just take the first element. So we can just say split on the T, and let's just do 0. So there we go. So we have our date. And it's not going to be a useState because, like I said, we're just going to assume that the date is always today, and we're not going to worry about this staying on for multiple days. So that part we took care of. We took care of today's date. Now, what kind of fields do we want in here? So we want to have this little selector field. And then we also want to have these two date fields. So let's have these. So we'll have two inputs that are date. Then we want a selector. So it's going to be a select and a close select. There we go. So the way a selector field works is it has option fields. So for every single option in here, you give it a field. So let's do that. And let's also give these fields. And if you see when you book, so we have a return value, and then we have a one-way value. So if we take a look at the description, they said that what we need is we need a one-way and then a return. So those are going to be our types. And let's go back to this thing. And so we're going to have states for those. So like I said, every single variable we're going to want to have a state. So we could just say like const. We can call it maybe like the first flight will be first, set first. Not the best names, but good enough. And we'll set this to... Actually, so this is going to be something else. So actually what we need really is we need the type of the flight. So it's going to be like const flight, set flight. And we're going to initialize it to be a one-way flight. So we can call it like one way or something. So we'll say use state one way. So there we go. And then it will just alternate between one way and return. So we need these two dates as well. So we're going to have this first date and the second date. And what we can set them to is just today. So we'll have the second, set second. We'll set them both to today, and we have today right here. So we'll do use state date and use state date. So now they should be set to today. We haven't really set the values yet. We'll do that in a second. So we have the selector. The selector should have two options, right? It should have this one-way flight and this return flight. So let's do that. So let's set options. And like I said, we don't really need labels. We're just going to use these area labels that I'll show in a second. So we're going to close out our option here. We're going to have two of these. And so the first option is going to have a one-way flight, and then the second option will be the return flight. So what we're going to want is the option is going to have a value. It's never going to change, right? The first option will never change from one-way flight, so we can just hard code the value in there. So we can just say this is going to be one-way, and the second one will be value return. Now, the important thing about these options is this value is actually like what the value that's going to be gotten from there. So it's going to display what's in here, what we write as like the title of it, but the actual value when they select it is going to be in this value field. So even though it says one-way flight, like if we print when they click one-way flight, what's our actual field here, it's going to say one-way. So now we can write for the title is going to be one-way flight. For the option, that's one of them, and then the other one should be return flight. So let's have that one. Return flight. Okay, so now we have this one-way flight, return flight, perfect. Now also, really quick, we can change the CSS a little bit to make our form go down, so let's do that really quick. So we'll just change our form, give it display flex, and flex direction column. And also we can align item center. So there we go. For now, we'll leave it like this. We'll worry about the next part later. So good enough for now. So we also need a button. It's going to be like the submit button for the form. And it's going to be called book, right? So there we go. We'll worry about the styling for it later. So now what we need to do is we need to actually give our selector a default value, right? We want to give it a default value. So if the user doesn't click on anything, there is no actual value here. So we can give it a value of, and we'll give it the value of flight. And this is what I mean by a controlled form. Every single input in here will have a state component. And then when we change it, we need to give it an on change. So it will have a value flight. And we also will give it this area label, right? And we'll call this, so we need to give it a label, so we'll call this like flight type. And you could think of like, this is the same as like an ID pretty much. except we don't need IDs yet, so it's not quite an ID. But like if a label points to an ID, now this area label will, if you actually have like a scraper go over this, it'll say there's a thing called flight type. Okay, we also need to give it an on change. So on change, what we need to do is we need to say, so the way to do this for all of these form fields is the way the on change works is you take an event, and what you want to do is you want to set your new whatever state variable is to the value of that event. So our event here is going to be flight, and that's what we need to be changing. So we can say set flight to event.target.value. And now, so that should be fine. Okay, so now we have that. Now we need to do this for the rest of the events, right? So for this date, we also need to do that, right? Because right now, like we can't, we need to actually save this in a state. So we're going to give it a value, and we're going to give it an on change as well, and this label. So this will be like, let's call this depart or something, departure. We also need to give it a value. So the value will be the first flight, and we need to give it an on change. So the same thing, on change. So we're going to do something like this. And now what we want to change is we don't want to set flight, but we want to do set first, right? Set first. And basically what happens here is when they change this event will be like what happens, and then the actual field that it gets changed to will be in this event target value. So the other thing we need to do is for the date, we need to make sure that it starts at today, right? The user can't click on like yesterday. So for this first date, for these dates have min maxes. So you can say min, and then you can give it a min, and we'll just say min equals date, right? So which is today. So now if we go here, we shouldn't be allowed to click on anything before today. And there we go. So I think it actually says it's the 9th today. So that's why we can't go back here. So we can't click on anything before today, which is good. Now for the second date, it's going to be very similar. So we can copy most of this. So this is going to be now, and then we'll clean it up a little bit later. So it's going to be like arrival or return or something, whatever you want. So the min here, remember we can't return before this first date. So the min here is actually going to be the first, and that's why this control form is useful, because we can store this date before we actually like submit the form, and we can use that date to make sure the second date is also big enough. So our min is going to be the first date, our value will be the second date, and then on change we just need to, instead of doing set first, we just need to do set second. So set second. And now let's see what we have here. So let's say I make the date the 27th. Now this shouldn't, yeah, so you can see we can't return before the 27th. So that part works. So let's see what else we need here. So the other thing we need is we need a state for like this one wait flight only has one field, and this return flight has two fields. So we can conditionally render the second input. So we could say something like add something here. Obviously, we'll clean it up a little bit bigger or a little bit later to make it like actually better. So what we basically need to check is if the flight type is one way, we need to show only one field. But if the flight type is return, so we could say like flight equals return. So if flight's return, then we could show the other component. We can just AND them. So let's take a look on the one-way flight. Now there's one. On the return flight, now there are two. So that part's fine. What else do we need to do? I think that's most of it. We are going to like style this a little and all that stuff, but yeah. So the main thing is, like I said, you need to have all your data needs to have a value, and all your data needs to have an on change, and then you're kind of looping, right? So what happens is the initial value will come from your state, and then anytime any of it changes, you will update your state to these values, and it makes it very easy to do validation, check all these things, and so on. So we need a couple other things. We need an on submit. So basically, like when they hit enter or when they click this book button, we need to have something. We can have a function called like handle submit, and we can just call it. So we're going to make that over here. So let's say we have constant handle submit, And we don't really need to take anything in handle submit because we have all our values in the state. So all we really need to do is just whatever they asked us to do. So let's just take a look here. So this is an arrow function. So really what we need is if it's a one-way flight, we need to write this. So we can do that. So remember, the way we could check is that it's the flight type, and it's either going to be one-way or return these two values. So we could say like if flight equals one-way, then we want to, and so what you really want is just like an alert, right? So you can just have an alert, and then we can just copy this message exactly. So we can just copy all of this. So we want all of it, and now we want the actual date though. We don't want like this 26 something. We want the actual date. So because our date is in a state, it's very convenient to access it. So we just change this to a template literal, and then we just write first is the first date. Otherwise, we do the other alert. So let's see what the other alert looks like. So if we have a return flight, we can copy all of this code. And we have an alert with a template literal with all of this. So this is the return date, which is the second date. And this is the first date. Okay. So now if we like book, we have it. So the other thing is, you notice if we hit book, it's refreshing. So what happens when you submit, it actually like tries to submit this to another URL. So if we don't want to do that, we want to do, we actually do want to take an event. So we can just take an event, that submit event, and we can say event.prevent default. Hopefully that's the right spelling. So now if we hit book, it doesn't refresh. So this is generally what you want to do for almost all your React stuff. Like you don't really need to submit functionality. You're not going to send like a post request or something to a URL. You're going to have some kind of like your own functionality. So this is almost always needed for forms on submit. And so basically whenever the button's clicked or whenever they hit like enter or so on, it'll trigger the submit. And we want to have this to make sure that the page doesn't refresh. Yeah, so now we can clean this up a little bit. So we'd like, this isn't so long. So we can say like select. We can put all these things tabbed. So we can do like this, something like this. Have the options in here, so it's a little bit cleaner now. Yeah. And then, yeah, so that part is fine. Yeah, we can do like this. Okay, and then the second one, we can do the same thing for like other stuff. So for like this input, we can say type is tabbed, area label, min, value on change, so it doesn't have like a billion characters per line. Same thing here, so we can have this, and then we can just put this in like parentheses. We don't really need, oh yeah, we do want parentheses actually. So we're gonna have this input, and then it's gonna be like this, just a little cleaner. Yeah, this is fine. And then we need this like close parenthesis over here, so we can do this. Like plenty of ways to style it. I think this looks reasonable. Now we don't have like multi-billion line stuff. We do have this still, which is like whatever. Not a big deal. Okay, so now it's pretty clean. So a couple other things I think that we're missing. This all works now, right? So the basic things to remember about the form is, like I said, you don't need the actual label. You can have this area label because you still want to have accessibility. You still want to have labels even though you don't have like a direct label. That way you don't need like IDs and stuff. It makes it a little bit easier. And yeah, this is a controlled form. You can also have an uncontrolled form. I personally prefer controlled form with states, but they do take more setup because you do have to have states for all your stuff. Now, if you did have a form with a ton of state, what you would do, because you don't want to just have like a state for one thing, let's say you have a form with like 20 fields, you can just make an object, and then you can just mutate that object instead of having this like all these things. So then the object can have all your fields, right? You're like flight, first, second, and so on. That way you don't have like 20 different states. So I'd say like once you have more than like 5, make an object. Okay, now, so what we want to do is we want to like all this is fine, right? This is all good. And notice if we did change this and now this doesn't work, if we hit book, this is what we want, right? So if we change the first value and the second value isn't past it, we have this form validation which is because we have this like min and max and stuff for the date. So that's useful. Now, the other things we need to do is we need to kind of have it look like this. So we can just do a little bit of styling. So we have a line item center. We want to have a gap between items. So you can just have gap like 10 pixels or something. It's fine. Now, the other thing we want is we want our children of the form, right? This like selector, these inputs, and the button to also be wider. So what you can actually do is you can say form with a little arrow, and then here you would have a child, but because we want all direct children for this, we can just have a star. Now we can give it width. So we can say width is like, let's try 100. See what happens. Okay, a little too big, so let's try like 70. And there we go. So we basically have roughly this. You can obviously modify it more, but we basically have our correct thing that works correctly. Now when we book it, yeah, so if we change this to something fine, then it gives us what we want. Yeah, so that's going to be everything for this one. Hopefully you liked it. I will be building more forms in the future that are more complicated. This one's obviously pretty simple. I think it is important to be able to build forms correctly and be able to build them quickly. I think like if you do front end, building forms should be like basically writing for loops after a while for you. Like you should be able to do automatic because like if you think about it, there's a ton of forms and form validation and all these things on most websites. So you should definitely be very good at that and be able to like take data, send it to an API, and so on and so on. So, and then I'll also probably go over uncontrolled forms in some other video. But if you did like this one, please like it and please subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think about these front end videos. I'll probably keep making more. I think it's pretty good practice making all these things. So thanks for watching.